Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here today because we're going to be looking at one of the most fascinating and frankly wild trajectories in modern history. We're unpacking the evolution of the world's most secretive organization, the Central Intelligence Agency. This is an agency that famously operates on a black budget, laundering power through offshore cash and shell companies, and as you'll see, it has evolved drastically since it was created back in 1947.
So let's tackle the big question right up front. How exactly does an agency with this kind of unchecked power and virtually unlimited funding drive continuous adaptation? Because, this isn't just a history of spies and trench coats. This is the story of how an organization went from operating in the literal post-World War II rubble to dominating today's highly complex algorithmic battlefield. It is arguably America's ultimate lever of power, and understanding its evolution actually explains a whole lot about the news you read today and the digital world you navigate every single day.
All right, part one, the birth of the agency and that massive post-World War II power vacuum.
Let's set the scene. It's 1945. The Second World War is ending in fire and rubble. The Red Army of the Soviet Union is occupying half of Europe, and the United States desperately needs a permanent peacetime spy agency. Why? Because frankly, they knew almost nothing about what the Soviets were actually planning. But there was a very stark contrast between the key players at the time. On one side, we had the Soviet KGB in the 1940s. The sources described them as the absolute gold standard of espionage, deeply entrenched, ruthless, and nearly untouchable. And on the other side, the early CIA. They were the rookies. Our sources note that early on, the CIA was fatally penetrated by informants. Missions were doomed before planes even left the runway, leading to these constant, humiliating failures. They needed to adapt, and they needed to do it fast.
Now, adaptation, that takes serious cash. And to get it without tipping off Congress or the American public, the CIA pulled off a truly audacious move. They quietly diverted $685 million from the Marshall Plan, which was the very program publicly meant to rebuild a war-torn Europe. This massive shadow war chest was then used to influence elections, fund friendly labor unions, and run sprawling propaganda campaigns. Moving on to part two, spies, tech, and coups, and this desperate need for a win.
So even with that massive budget, the agency was terrified of being seen as an amateur sideshow. They desperately needed a headline victory to prove their competence to the White House and, of course, strike terror into their enemies. The 1950s and beyond turned into an absolute blur of covert action. The CIA successfully toppled governments in Iran in 1953, Guatemala in 1954, and Chile in 1973 using everything from propaganda to mercenaries to intense economic pressure. But they also faced some searing, highly public humiliations along the way, most notably in Cuba in 1961. Let's zoom in on that first major event. Operation Ajax in 1953 was hailed at the time as a textbook covert operation. Using over $1 million in CIA funds, operatives bribed politicians, paid newspaper editors to literally print lies, and rallied military officers to overthrow Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, ultimately returning the oil fields to Western influence. However, our sources note the intense gravity of this move. Toppling a democracy for oil planted a seed of chaos that drastically reshaped the Middle East we know today. It set a very dangerous precedent for future interventions.
But covert power wasn't always a silver bullet, and the failures were catastrophic. The 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion, an attempt by CIA-trained exiles to overthrow Fidel Castro, collapsed within days. It was a searing embarrassment that completely shattered America's image of invincibility. It actually led a deeply frustrated President John F. Kennedy to ask how he could have been so stupid as to rely on their advice, and he vowed never to be overawed by the CIA again.
So, what's the big takeaway here? Basically, human espionage was just too messy, heavily infiltrated by foreign agents, and struggling to beat the KGB at traditional spycraft. The agency made a massive strategic pivot. They stopped trying to outspy the KGB in the back alleys, and they leaned heavily into what America was exceptionally good at, building great technologies.
And the ultimate result of that pivot? The U-2 spy plane. This wasn't just an airplane. It was essentially a spy satellite with a pilot. Flying at 70,000 feet, which was higher than any Soviet fighter or missile could even reach at the time, it could photograph objects just 2 feet wide from 13 miles up. Think about that. The Soviets could see it on their radar, but they literally couldn't touch it. It was a major technological triumph that completely redrew the maps in the Pentagon.
All right, part three, scandals in the shadows. We are entering the messy era of dark money.
As the Cold War dragged on through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, these shadow wars really expanded, and the agency's methods went to astonishing, sometimes downright absurd extremes. The sources detail programs like the Phoenix program in Vietnam, which built intelligence networks using tactics so brutal they left a permanent mark on America's reputation. Domestically, you had Project MKUltra, where the CIA literally experimented on unwitting subjects with LSD and psychological torture, genuinely hoping to unlock real-life mind control or engineer a Manchurian candidate. And internationally, operations were quietly fueled by looking the other way on heroin trafficking in Laos and Cambodia, all bankrolled through secret Swiss bank accounts. All of these unchecked operations eventually culminated in massive financial scandals in the 1980s. The sources outline how the CIA arranged secret arms sales to Iran at inflated prices to help free hostages, and then quietly funneled those profits right over to the Contras in Nicaragua. This era also saw the CIA heavily utilizing BCCI, a massive global shadow bank. BCCI's incredibly complex web of shell companies allowed the agency to launder billions for covert operations without leaving a trace, at least until regulators ultimately shut the whole bank down in a coordinated global sweep back in 1991.
Which brings us to Part 4, the War on Terror, a lost mission and an entirely new war.
So, it's 1991, and the geopolitical map experiences a complete seismic shift. The Soviet Union collapses, and this posed a huge existential crisis for the agency. I mean, without the KGB, what exactly is the CIA for? The Cold War had given them this very clear defining mission. Now budgets shrank, overseas stations closed up, experienced officers retired, the agency seemingly lost its purpose overnight. But, as our sources note, that calm definitely would not last. The devastating attacks on September 11th forced the CIA right back into the center of the storm. The mission pivoted entirely to counterterrorism, causing budgets to just swell exponentially. However, this intense, high-stakes pressure also led to profound mistakes. The sources detail how the CIA insisted Iraq held weapons of mass destruction, intelligence that was fundamentally flawed and built on really bad sources, which ultimately justified the U.S. invasion of Iraq, where, as we know, no such weapons were ever found.
As that war mutated into these really messy ground conflicts with insurgents, the CIA realized they needed a different approach. They wanted something cleaner, faster, and cheaper than special forces raids or car bombs. So, partnering with the Air Force, they developed remote eyes in the sky. By arming Predator drones with Hellfire missiles, a pilot sitting safely in a trailer in Nevada could track and destroy targets in Pakistan or Yemen without risking a single American life. It was, quite literally, a war without borders. And finally, Part 5, the algorithmic future. We're talking data, AI, and near-peer rivals.
You see, hunting highly decentralized terror networks like Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda required another massive leap, this time straight into the world of data processing and artificial intelligence. The agency partnered with a Silicon Valley startup called Palantir to ingest massive, incredibly disparate points of data. We're talking phone calls, travel logs, bank wires, live drone footage. Palantir's software basically gulped it all down and wove it into a single living map. This allowed the CIA to connect hidden dots that no human could ever see unaided, shifting their capability from just responding to threats to actually anticipating them before they even happened.
When you look back at it all laid out like this, the evolution is just staggering. Going from fighting the Soviet Union with human spies and covert coups during the Cold War, to utilizing drones and AI against decentralized terror networks, and today, in the modern era, the strategy has had to shift yet again. The agency is now utilizing advanced AI, quantum tech, and cyber espionage to face near-peer competitors like China, who are currently leading in areas like hypersonic weapons and surveillance. It has, for sure, become an algorithmic battlefield. And that brings us to our final thought today. The CIA has been the saboteur, the kingmaker, and the innovator. It has adapted continuously for over 75 years. But today, information spreads instantly, and our demographic systems are far more interconnected and fragile than ever before. So, I want to leave you with this. In an era of maximum complexity where one single mistake could set off an unstoppable chain of events, can the ultimate shadow agency still control the world's narrative? It is definitely a fascinating question to ponder. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep learning.